Welcome. My name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. Today, we're telling a very big story of the Vatican and the Holocaust. Boy, is that an important story. And no one film can do that subject justice, but the film that you've all seen, Holy Silence, comes very close. It's a remarkable film, and we're very privileged to have with us the filmmaker, STEVEN PRESSMAN. In addition, we are graced today with the presence of the author, Peter Eisner, who wrote the definitive book about the two heroes featured in STEVEN PRESSMAN's film, notably Pope Pius XI and the American Jesuit priest, Father John LaFarge. And our third panelist is Father Charles Gallagher, who is himself both a priest and a professor. He's a historian and an expert as well on the Vatican and the Holocaust. So before I turn the floor over to our speakers, I do want to make a point, which is that here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation, we honor a hero, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was a devout Catholic man. His Catholic faith was the motivator behind his effort to rescue tens of thousands of people, including my own family. So I have a personal debt of gratitude that can never be repaid to this man. And what I wanted to point out was that many thousands of the rescuers that have been honored by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations were Catholic, and the vast majority were Christian of some denomination. And we're not here to cast any aspersions, but we are here to talk about the highest echelon of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church during not only World War II, but the entire Nazi period from 1933 to 1945. That's really the focal point, these two popes and how different they were. And I'm very excited to present a story to you because it's a narrative that may be very different from the narrative you had previously held about the Vatican and the Holocaust. While our speakers are speaking, I invite you to put your questions into the chat box. You will remain muted. And we also don't recognize raised hands, so we do ask everybody to type your questions out. And then when it comes time for the Q&A period later in the hour, I will be grabbing your questions and voicing them to our panel. So right now, it's my honor and privilege to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Mr. Peter Eisner. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Olivia. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. This is a very important story to me. Holy Silence and my book, The Pope's Last Crusade, for me are a look at moral clarity at a key moment in history. And the two main characters that I focused on that you've seen in the book are people that I set out to give the honor and the space that they often have not received. One of them, none less than a pope, and the other, a very humble Jesuit journalist who was called into the maelstrom of World War II by surprise and pretty much against his will. These two people, as you've known, are Pope Pius XI and John LaFarge. One thing I should say about Pope Pius XI is, so obscured has he been in history that outside of the church, when one says Pope Pius XI, one thinks that we're actually talking about his successor, Pope Pius XII. So my goal throughout this has been to change the vision of who this man was and who his principal aid was in trying to fight Nazism, fascism, and anti-Semitism on the eve of World War II. So let's start with the first of the people that I'm thinking of, who is John LaFarge, a young man who decided early on that he had a vocation to become a priest. Teddy Roosevelt, none other, was a friend of his family's and convinced his parents with their skepticism that he did have that vocation and that he should have the right to become a Jesuit priest, which he did in the course of the early 1900s after attending Harvard University. He was eventually assigned as one of his first jobs was to work with a very poor, predominantly African-American community in Southern Maryland, in St. Mary's County, where his life work really developed and changed. He was surrounded by a community that was devout and working hard to better itself and themselves. And he realized and the idea crystallized that the only difference between this group of people who were hardscrabble, doing the best they could do, but very, very poor, was that they were not given the opportunities that others had been given. And he quickly developed a great bond with the folks of St. Mary's and realized that one of his great missions could be to bring the Catholic Church into righting the wrong that had befallen African Americans, such as these people in the United States. And that led to a life of fighting for human rights and civil rights in the United States that went from St. Mary's County to Washington, D.C. in the final days and months of his life when he marched with Martin Luther King in 1963 in the March on Washington. After recognizing in the early 20s and 30s that this was to be his mission, he was transferred to New York, where he became an associate editor of America magazine, which was and is still the predominant Jesuit magazine in the United States. And as he was doing that in 1937, he began to crystallize the ideas that he had developed about civil rights and wrote a book that would be a huge difference in his life and a huge difference in Catholic life, called Interracial Justice. Interracial Justice was published in 1937, and you can see that it had very specific things to talk about: humanity, the rights of people, prejudice, segregation. And he developed a concept that was simply this: racism is a fraud. There is only one race, and it's the human race. And that began to have resonance among thinkers in the Catholic Church in the 1930s. Imagine 1937, when something else was happening. Hitler had taken power in Germany in 1933. Mussolini was following the life of following the Nazi program as well. And LaFarge was asked by America magazine to see how bad was the situation. The editors in America magazine wondered, well, how much is this a little bit of hype, or are the Nazis doing what they really seem to be doing? And he started a reporting tour in Europe in 1938. It took him to England, it took him to Paris, it took him to Germany, where he saw the full-fledged attempts of the Nazis to sell their propaganda and lies to the German people. From there, he moved on and ended up in Rome. And that trip to Rome, what made all the difference. It turned out that Pope Pius XI, who was a voracious reader, a librarian before he was Pope, among other things, had read John LaFarge's book. And days before LaFarge was supposed to return to the United States, he suddenly found himself summoned to the Pope's summer palace in Castel Gandolfo, south of Rome. He had no idea what to expect. He even thought that perhaps the Pope was angered because he'd been too forthright, too progressive in writing his book, Interracial Justice. But when he got to Castel Gandolfo, he found something quite different. That first of all, the Pope had his book on his desk. Second of all, the Pope said, I want you to help me do something that is the correlation of what you did in writing Interracial Justice. I want to write an encyclical, that is the highest statement that a Pope can issue, that would say that, just what you said, that there's only one race, the human race. And this will be a challenge and a dispute and a reevaluation of where the church stands on dealing with Hitler and the Nazis, Mussolini and fascism, and anti-Semitism itself. LaFarge was floored by this. Humble priest that he was, he said the rock of St. Peter had fallen upon him. And throughout the rest of 1938, he went off in secret because the Pope was concerned that not everybody agreed with him within the church and within the Vatican, to write this encyclical, which would be the strongest statement so far, in which the church used its weight in a last effort to stop Hitler and the Nazis. Something was happening at the same time. One was the Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, did not agree with the Pope and was doing whatever he could to slow down the effort to write this encyclical, which he even found out about because it was somewhat secret behind the scenes. And Pacelli was able to delay it partly because the Pope was increasingly ill, suffering from heart problems. And at times, Pacelli was having more and more a role in running the church. This was a drama and a race for time on the part of the Pope, to the point where he finally, after many delays, had John LaFarge's encyclical on his desk in early 1939. And so he summoned the bishops from around Italy to a meeting on February 10th, 1939, to say that he was launching his campaign. No one knew exactly what was going to happen. There were rumors that he might even excommunicate Hitler, who was after all a Catholic, and Mussolini. They were concerned, so were many in the church, that the Pope was moving too quickly. But the Pope appeared to have come down with a cold and was sinking fast. He begged his doctors to keep him going so that he could literally make it to February 10th, but he died the day before. With his death, the church's ability to fight the Nazis changed. As you'll see, and as the film shows us, Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII, was quite different and had a quite different view, much more connected and much more in line with Germany, at least. You've seen that he's been called Hitler's Pope, which may be a simplification and may be somewhat unfair, but let's think about that. LaFarge was basically silenced, and his story and his ability to tell what he had done that year of 1938 was delayed and blocked for 25 years until the last months of his life. when he revealed what he had done that summer in 1938. And that is really what prompted me to be able to write The Pope's Last Crusade, which is the story of this moral effort to stop the onslaught of Nazism at the start of World War II. It was an effort that failed, but not for its moral clarity. You'll be hearing more about this from my friends to come. And let me at this moment pass it along to my dear friend, Father Charles Gallagher, who I met in the course of writing this book and honor and am delighted to maintain the friendship with him. Father
Thank you,
Gallagher.
Peter. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for your friendship. It has been a very prized relationship to me, and also to be associated with you and your family and your great writing. Your book is a book that is compelling about someone who was behind the scenes and yet was a moral hero. I'd like to talk a little bit today about the same time period, a contemporary of LaFarge's, who was also in the Vatican, and may come out to us as not entirely heroic, but at least semi-heroic. And in order to understand that, we need to look at the person's background. One of my earliest teachers always believed in the theme that the child is the father of the man. So the person I'm talking about is Bishop Joseph Patrick Hurley, who is seen here as the bishop of the Diocese of St. Augustine in Florida, where he was assigned in 1940. But between 1934 and 1940, he was the first American ever to be assigned as a diplomat to the Secretariat of State of the Holy See. That is, meaning the diplomatic corps of the Holy See. As I write about Hurley, I talk about him as a young American, Irish Catholic, working class, born in Cleveland. And I think his background as in Cleveland had implications for how he viewed Vatican diplomacy early on. He was born and raised in an Irish enclave of Cleveland, near the Cleveland rolling mills, where his father worked, an enclave called Newburgh. And I was able to figure out that the Irish neighborhood in Cleveland where he lived backed up onto the edge of a shtetl. And it was not uncommon. In fact, there's a recorded diary entry that it was a yearly event for the Irish kids from Newburgh to go around and try to beat up the Jewish kids from the Jewish neighborhood. And so this was, for a young teenager, something that was in the air. No documentation that he ever participated in any of this activity, but it does give us a little insight into, I think, his actions or inactions later on. He ends up, because he's a very bookish young man, he's born into a family of 11 siblings. He's quite bookish, so he becomes the one who joins the priesthood, and he's sent to the Jesuit high school in Cleveland called St. Ignatius College. The Jesuits are a religious order in the Roman Catholic Church that is global, originally started in Spain, known for their educational work. But the Jesuits at St. Ignatius during this period did exhibit some antithetical philosophies against Jews. They created pamphlets which made some derogatory remarks about Jews, which Hurley saved, and I found in his archive. But they kind of created this sense of competition between Catholics and Jews in society. The Jesuits wanted to propel their young students into the higher echelons of American decision-making. And they felt that, that there was a competition here between Catholics and Jews. And so that was the style of the philosophy of his high school. At the same time in that high school, there was another impulse, and that was known as muscular Catholicism. In other words, that religion should not be considered an effete impulse, or that those who were religious can equally be, in the words of that time, manly and muscular in terms of not only advancing the religion in society, but advancing their own position in society within which to take decisions. So he comes out of this milieu. He is a spiritual guy, a very religious guy. He originally tries to get acceptance into West Point to be an officer in the Army, but then ends up entering the seminary. And he kind of takes all of this to the seminary with him. He's extremely brilliant. He kind of places out and places above all other students in the seminary. He becomes adept at languages, and then suddenly he's assigned to, by his bishop, his talent is noticed, and he's assigned to be a possibility for a diplomatic career in the Vatican. So his bishop sends him kind of off the cuff, sends him to Toulouse, France, to study diplomatic relations at the University of Toulouse. And from there, he keeps in touch with his mentors back in Cleveland, who then arranged for him to enter the diplomatic service through a priest from Cleveland, Edward Mooney, who would later go on to become a cardinal in the church. And Hurley and Mooney follow each other. Hurley follows Mooney's coattails all the way through Mooney's diplomatic career, which posts him in Bangalore, India for 3 years, and then in Tokyo, Japan for 3 years. Interesting little side episode in Tokyo when Hurley is 1933, Hurley's at a diplomatic reception, and he starts having a long and very chummy conversation with the ambassador from the Soviet Union. And this gets back to his superiors at the Vatican, and he almost loses his job. And so it's at that point in 1933 that Hurley becomes sensitive to what I call in my writings the notion of theological anti-communism, that the Catholic Church isn't antithetical to communism, not simply as a political ideology, but there's also a theology behind that. In 1934, he leaves Tokyo and ends up in the Vatican, in the heart of Rome, working for the Secretariat of State. And he does all the usual things and is on the fast track for continued advancement between 1934 and 1939. In 1939, the United States sends a diplomat, Myron Charles Taylor, to Rome. And Myron Charles Taylor is, in fact, his official title is the personal representative of the president to His Holiness Pope Pius XII. He can't have ambassadorial status because back home, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians are raising a hue and cry about having any representation to the Vatican. And so Myron Charles Taylor shows up in the Vatican, and the first person he meets is Hurley. And Taylor effectively recruits Hurley into the American camp. Hurley, and by that I mean Hurley is politically amenable to pushing the pro-democracy line in the Vatican, which Taylor is also pushing. But we have to keep, that sounds strange to our ears, but even in the 1930s, the Holy See was very skeptical of democracy. They were skeptical of many things. They were skeptical of not only Freemasonry and communism, but the French Revolution wasn't very kind to the Catholic Church. So there was this lingering suspicion about how these democratic countries actually would work. And in fact, it comes out later, as we know, that Woodrow Wilson engaged in secret treaty making in World War I to try to exclude the Vatican from any peace conference. And so the Holy See's diplomatic corps kind of, a little bit kind of skeptical of, or at least they're wary of the Americans in all this. And so one of Taylor's objectives is to push a peace conference where the Pope would play a role. And FDR was okay with that. And Hurley goes along with that, pushing those efforts. And then there's, again, this kind of clandestine effort to push this pro-democracy, pro-American line at the Vatican. So these two impulses, this kind of anti-Judaism, verging on anti-Semitism, but also a very strong high level of pro-Americanism, show up with Hurley in the Vatican. And it all coalesces in a vortex around a priest who has a radio show, Father Charles Coughlin, out of Detroit, Michigan in the 1930s. And Father Coughlin becomes one of the foremost Catholic personalities and celebrities of the 1930s. And so Hurley is in charge of the situation connected to Father Coughlin, because Father Coughlin's speeches on the radio, where he has about 30 million listeners a week, his speeches are becoming increasingly anti-Semitic. And the person who's placed in charge of shaping the Vatican response to Father Coughlin's anti-Semitism is this young man from Cleveland, Joseph Patrick Hurley. So what emerges inside the Vatican, which we're able to track, is that as Coughlin's speeches become more anti-Semitic after Kristallnacht, November 1938, Hurley gives the reporting to the Pope, but he sanitizes the complaints about Coughlin, which are connected to Coughlin's anti-Semitism. These are complaints by Catholic officials who want to condemn Coughlin for and take Coughlin off the air for his anti-Semitism. And instead, so Hurley, in his reports to the Pope, kind of sanitizes that or excises that from his reports and argues that Coughlin is a problem in the United States, specifically for this word that Hurley uses called his unpatriotism. He's not abiding by American mores. And so the sin of Father Coughlin becomes not a sin of anti-Semitism, but something to do with a mix of Catholic nationalism and what Hurley calls unpatriotism. So there's this light and shadow that shows up at the Vatican, because Hurley is deeply anti-Nazi, but he's also trying to shield Coughlin from criticisms on anti-Semitism. This brings up one occasion of this is Hurley's work with a magazine in the Vatican, which has largely been understudied, called Illustrazione Vaticana. And the editorial board at that magazine reads kind of like a who's who of pro-Democrats inside the Vatican. The historian Frank Coppa kind of started to reveal all this around 2008 and 2009 in his books, but there were these pro-Democrats who were becoming more and more anti-Nazi, and these were the sort of things they were doing. This was a cultural magazine, it was a glossy magazine, it was kind of like an effort towards Vatican pro-democracy propaganda, which I think is really interesting to note. And so that's just one point. A second point is that Hurley goes underground to actually condemn the Nazis in a speech that is reported on by the BBC and their correspondent Arnold Lunn. In 1940, just shortly after France falls, Hurley goes on the air anonymously, but speaking in his American accent over Vatican radio, really castigating the Nazis. And 6 months earlier, there was a change in popes. And Hurley makes this anonymous speech over Vatican radio, indicating that the church is wrong in their new positioning on kind of stepping back from a full-throated condemnation of Nazism. It's really an extraordinary speech. And Arnold Lunn, who some historians say have connections to British intelligence, he makes sure that Hurley's speech is reported on in all the press in the West. It actually makes the front pages of the New York Times. And so it's kind of these kind of incidents that really show, as I mentioned earlier, just kind of shadow with an uncertainty about Judaism on the part of Hurley, but real kind of light and a new pathway about really being earnest in condemning Nazism from within the Vatican. Of course, the the Vatican officials figure out who made that speech quite quickly. And as I write elsewhere, within 72 hours, Hurley was named, signed, sealed, and delivered as a bishop of the Diocese of St. Augustine, because it was the first bishop who died in office. He was quickly shunted into that position in 72 hours in a process that usually takes about 18 months. It was done pretty much by the Pope in about 72 hours. So he's quickly gotten out of the Vatican, and so we lose that kind of anti-Nazi voice in the Vatican. And so here we are now with a tale of two popes. These Pope Pius XI, kind of aggressive anti-Nazis who are willing to call balls and strikes on Nazism, and then the policy of the new Pope, which I've written elsewhere. I find it grounded in a diplomatic technique called absolute impartiality, which goes to Eugenio Pacelli, who's the Secretary of State, goes to his diplomatic training, and he wants to keep the Vatican entirely neutral in the world. And that impulse does not come from anything religious. It comes from the Hague conferences in 1899 and 1907 that said neutral states, in order to have the ability to broker a peace in wartime, need to maintain absolute impartiality, which is a tightened and heightened level of what we call today neutrality. So anyway, it's a technical distinction, and that leaves us with Steve Pressman's amazing movie, very compelling movie and heartfelt movie, Holy Silence, about this whole issue. And so now I'll hand the commentary over to my friend Steve Pressman. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Charlie. And it's one of the great pleasures of making a film like this is the opportunity, quite honestly, to get to know and then to include in the film people like Peter, people like Father Gallagher, both of whom have become good friends. And it's always such a pleasure to, in fact, as a filmmaker, I like to say that people like Peter and Charlie and others who appear in the film, they're the ones who have done the hard work for me, because I draw upon their scholarship, their expertise as historians to help me make the film that I did when I was making Holy Silence. Peter's book, the work that Father Gallagher has done, people like David Kurtzer and Susan Zuccotti. I've got the easy job of just sort of stitching it all together. When I started out to make the film Holy Silence, I have to admit right off the top right at the top that I actually knew very, very little about the role of the Vatican, what they were doing, and of course, what more importantly, perhaps what they were not doing during the years of the Holocaust, and of course in the years leading up to the Holocaust. So I knew that all I knew was that I was taking on a pretty controversial topic. So for instance, and we've already referred to folks like figures like Father Coughlin. Father Gallagher referred to Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin I was familiar with. I had made a reference to him in an earlier film I had made. So I knew about his notoriety and his fame as a radio priest. I think, in fact, in Holy Silence, Charlie, you make the point that Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin, at the height of his popularity, probably was more popular than even the talk show hosts that we've come to know in recent years, people like Rush Limbaugh and others. Coughlin had tens of millions of listeners. And again, as Charlie had mentioned, throughout the 1930s, Father Coughlin was becoming increasingly anti-Semitic. So when I first began to put together the film, I was thinking about people like Coughlin, but I also knew that I wanted to tell a broader story. And as soon as I came across thanks to Peter and to David Kurtzer, who had also written about the story of the so-called hidden encyclical and the role that Father LaFarge had played. That's when I knew that I was going to shift the emphasis in Holy Silence into a slightly different direction. I will say, as a filmmaker, as somebody who has worked on historical topics, particularly related to the Holocaust, I've always had an interest in also sort of telling an American story or an American side of the story. And I knew that with figures like Father Coughlin, like Father LaFarge, I had that opportunity. I was learning about some new people, some Catholic figures in America that I had not been familiar with prior to my doing the work on the film. So, for instance, in the 1930s, the Archbishop of Chicago was a priest named George Mundelein, who was very close with Franklin Roosevelt. As you see, they met often. Roosevelt considered Cardinal Mundelein to be a good friend. From a political point of view, Franklin Roosevelt was a consummate politician, and he made no secret of his interest in currying favor with Catholic voters throughout the United States. But George Mundelein was an interesting person in his own right, increasingly anti-Nazi in his sentiments. He somewhat famously, in May of 1937, very derisively, very sarcastically, really, referred to Adolf Hitler as, quote, an Austrian paper hanger, and a poor one at that. A description of Hitler he gave publicly at a diocese conference in Chicago, and he at the same conference he accused Nazi officials of fostering, as he put it, a malicious propaganda against the church. So Cardinal Mundelein, no friend of Nazi Germany, increasingly came to criticize the Nazis for their ever increasing brutal treatment of Jews in Nazi Germany. And indeed, George Mundelein himself, because of his comments, also came to the attention of Pope Pius XI, who would call him a defender of the church. So again, as a filmmaker who was toggling back and forth between Americans and these high-ranking Vatican officials, Pope Pius XI, obviously chief among them, Eugenio Pacelli, who we've referred to, who of course becomes Pius XII. I knew that I had this interesting cast of characters. And of course, once I became much more familiar, thanks to Peter, thanks to David Kurtzer and others, of the hidden encyclical episode, I knew I had a very dramatic story to tell. And indeed, the story of the hidden encyclical basically takes up about the first half of the film. I'll never forget when I was putting the film together and working with my very talented film editor, we reached that unfortunate for historical purposes, but for my purposes, for dramatic purposes as well, that moment in time, as Peter mentioned earlier, when on the verge of issuing that encyclical, Pope Pius XI suddenly dies and is succeeded by Pope Pius XII. And my editor and I turned to each other and said, we just lost the best dramatic story, but we're only halfway through the film. And of course, that's when the film pivots toward, and Charlie, you took the words right out of my mouth when you mentioned this whole episode in history as a tale of two popes. And indeed, the moment that the pontificate switches from Pope Pius XI to his successor, to Pacelli, who becomes Pius XII, really the tone and tenor of history as it pertains to the Vatican's response to Nazi Germany and ultimately to the Holocaust also turns on a dime. But in terms of completing that second half of the film, I really continued with that narrative of what some American officials, both clerical and diplomatic and political, were trying to do during this dark period in history to really try to influence what they hoped would be a strong Vatican response to Nazi Germany. So, for instance, again, we've heard mention of Myron Taylor. Myron Taylor, who was, as Charlie mentioned, Franklin Roosevelt's personal envoy to the Vatican. Myron Taylor was not a Catholic, but he very enthusiastically, just as he was on the verge of retirement in America, Myron Taylor was one of the leading businessmen and industrialists of the 20th century. He had made a fortune in the world of business, but he offered his services to Franklin Roosevelt, or rather, I should say, Franklin Roosevelt turned to Myron Taylor and asked him to take on this very touchy assignment of being his personal envoy to Pope Pius XII, an assignment that Myron Taylor launched into with great enthusiasm. It was a difficult assignment because Pope Pius XII was somebody who was insistent on remaining neutral. He saw his role as that of a diplomat, as that of a negotiator, and he, for better or worse at the time, thought that his role would be as potentially as a peacemaker, and the best way to do that in his mind was to remain neutral and above the fray as World War II erupted, pitting the forces of Nazi Germany against the West, against the Allies. So as I was working on this film, I realized that one, decades later, witnessed simply by the fact that we're having this discussion today, the role of the Vatican during the Holocaust really has remained this almost lightning rod issue that in many ways, for decades and decades since World War II, has continued, among other things, to kind of shape and often in difficult ways, Jewish-Catholic relations, among other things. We continue to grapple with the legacy of Pope Pius XII. Just as I was finishing the film, I was in the final stages of the film when Pope Francis announced, this was a few years ago now, that he was at long last going to open up the long secret archives pertaining to Pope Pius XII. The archives involving Pope Pius XI had been open for some years, and so scholars and historians had been immersed in those archives. But the debate over the role that Pius XII played during the Holocaust, bits and pieces had come out over the years, including, of course, as we've discussed today, the fact that Pope Pius XII was no friend behind the sentiments of the Encyclical that his predecessor had been prepared to issue with the help of Father LaFarge and a few others. Pope Pius XII had a very different view of how he wanted to conduct his papacy, particularly as it pertained to Nazi Germany. But there were many more, there were in fact millions of documents pertaining to the Pius XII's pontificate that have only in the last couple of years begun to come to light. So even as we speak, scholars and historians and others are continuing to dig through those millions of pages of archives. I think, and again, I'm not the scholar. I turn to people like Charlie and Peter and others for the historical perspective. My sense, though, is that the general narrative, the general conclusions that have been reached for a number of years now, involving, in particular, Pius XII, not likely to change dramatically. I think we're going to learn new details here and there. A few months back, thanks to some of the research that David Kurtzer and others have done, we've seen a few details about some back channel communications that Pius XII was engaging in with representatives of Hitler's government. But nothing so far, I think, dramatically will change that narrative. So when I look back to a film like Holy Silence, or when I when I think of the work that that my friends Peter and Charlie have done, and the voices that they gave to my film, I think we're left with just sort of some, I guess, difficult conclusions to reach after all these years about the role of both the Catholic Church in general and officials at the Vatican in particular. And in closing, all I'll say as a filmmaker, and I have to admit, and I will say in all honesty, as a Jewish filmmaker, I never wanted to make a film, and I deliberately made every effort not to make a film that was going to be that could be dismissed as basically some sort of ad hominem attack on the Catholic Church, or indeed on the Vatican itself or the papacy. That was never my intention, and indeed that's why I was so thrilled to be able to focus this story, as we've been doing for this afternoon, on these two very different popes in terms of their temperament, personality, ideology, and the roles they saw as the leader of the Catholic Church. And in telling that sort of story of two popes in the film, I always was interested in exploring those very complex figures and times in history that in looking back, in hindsight, of course, so easy for us to say, how could things have happened as they did, when the moral choices seem to us all these decades later to be crystal clear. At the time, for a variety of reasons, it turns out things weren't quite that crystal clear to certain folks, both inside and outside the Vatican. And I hope that discussions like this, I hope that books like those that Charlie and Peter have written and continue to write, I hope that films like mine continue to have us all exploring these very, very difficult, complex, moral, ethical, religious discussions that we've been having, and I'm sure we'll continue to have. So thank you very much to my friends, and it's been a great honor to be part of this discussion.
Great. So there are a ton of audience questions, which we'll get to in a few minutes. Right now, I'm going to just tell our audience about upcoming programs of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So first of all, you may have heard that tonight is the premiere of the new Ken Burns film, The United States and the Holocaust, the US and the Holocaust. It's a 3-part film that was supposed to air tonight, tomorrow, and Tuesday, but it turns out that the Queen's funeral is preempting tomorrow's broadcast. So I would urge you to check your local station for the broadcasting, but it does start tonight. And I mention it because this Thursday, we are having a program in response to the Ken Burns film. And it's another program like today that you will not want to miss. It's a free program. I encourage you to tell all your friends to sign up. It's going to be this Thursday at 7 p.m. and our guest will be Raphael Medoff, who is the leading expert in the world today on the US and the Holocaust, as well as Martin Ostro, who is himself a filmmaker who did another PBS film called America in the Holocaust for the American Experience series. And in a way, the Ken Burns film supplants the Martin Ostro film in a way. So we'll see the filmmaker of the earlier PBS film commenting on his successor's film. That should be absolutely fascinating. And I hope you will all sign up. Then there are the Jewish holidays, which is why our program is Thursday and not Sunday. So we do have the Jewish holidays, but right after Rosh Hashanah, we're presenting a story on October 2nd, Sunday, October 2nd. It's a discussion of a beautiful film called Secret Lives, Hidden Children and Their Rescuers. So that's going to be another very, very heartwarming, very important program. But I also want to mention something else. And that is that little by little, the Sousa Mendes Foundation is going back to live events, live programming as our world starts to open up. And I do want to mention that we have a very important event coming up in November, not in the United States, but actually in Israel. We're going to be dedicating a city square to Sousa Mendes. We have the mayor of Jerusalem with whom we've been working hard. And so November 8th, we have a dedication ceremony. And I'm mentioning it today because if you plan to be in Israel around November 8th, or if you have family members there who would like to be invited, let us know and we will get you an invitation. Okay, so after today's program, you will receive an email giving you information about how to sign up for these upcoming programs. Now to audience questions. And boy, everybody wants to know the answer to 2 questions, which I'm going to ask right off the bat. Is there any trace of this encyclical that survives? And was Pope Pius XI murdered?
I guess I can answer this. The encyclical was ordered destroyed and hidden by Pope Pius XII, and he even ordered the future Pope Paul VI to destroy all traces of it, but that didn't happen. Various versions of it in various languages emerged starting in the 1980s. When I was doing my book, I actually found at Boston College, where Father Gallagher teaches, the annotated and edited first version of Father LaFarge's encyclical itself. And I found a French version of it as well. So Pius XII's attempt to remove this from history failed. And so we have the entire document. My book has some text from key portions of it, the portions of it that condemn Hitler and condemn anti-Semitism, for example. And so it survived.
And what about that other question?
Very interesting question. There are theories about that, about Pius XI's death and the strange timing of his death. A couple of things are true, and one thing is very strange. Hitler and Mussolini, by 1938, considered Pius XI to be their enemy. Mussolini even mused it would be a better thing if he were dead at some point. The Pope had a terrible heart condition, yet he was suffering from congestive heart failure for years, and the treatment of that was not very advanced at that time. So he often was not well. However, it's just interesting to say that one of the Vatican physicians, and the one that was on duty the last days of Pope Pius XI's life, was a physician named Francesco Patachi. And he happened to be the father of Clara Patachi, who was Mussolini's mistress. So there's, based on that, and based on other things that are long-winded that I describe in the book, there's been speculation forever about that. If I had to fall on an answer, I would say the Pope was very ill, and that illness led to his death. But the other elements do exist.
Okay, there's a lot that's talked about in the film about all of the beautiful monuments of Rome, the religious artifacts, the cathedrals, all of the stuff that the Pope Pius XII didn't want bombed. So is there any evidence that there was some sort of a deal made that it wouldn't get bombed in exchange for certain things the Pope did or didn't say or do?
Well, I'll jump in on that one. I'm not sure about that. Much has been, and to be honest, yet another one of the criticisms that have been leveled over the years against Pope Pius XII was that despite his ongoing insistence on neutrality, despite his ongoing refusal to specifically mention Jews as the victims of Nazi Germany, he had no hesitancy at all to implore the Allies, as it turned out, not to bomb the city of Rome, and in particular, in order to avoid doing damage to churches and to the Vatican itself. We have to remember a little bit of history of World War II, where Italy, Mussolini's Italy, begins the war on the side of the Nazis. By the end of the war, of course, Mussolini is gone from the scene. Italy surrenders, sides with the Allies. It is the Germans at that point who come in to occupy Rome, and it's the Allies that, at that point, as they're coming up from the south to continue the liberation of Italy and ultimately the liberation of Rome, they are the ones that are carrying out bombing runs over Rome, and Pope Pius XII went out of his way to constantly call on the Allies not to bomb Rome, not to bomb the Vatican. You might hit churches, you might hit these treasures that are completely irreplaceable, all the while remaining essentially silent in terms of the Nazis' treatment of the Jews. The Allies, the British and the Americans, if you believe the correspondence of the day, tried to assure, and indeed Franklin Roosevelt, who has an ongoing, throughout the war, has an ongoing correspondence directly with the Pope, as well as using Myron Taylor and others to carry out his diplomatic efforts with the Pope, continues to tell Pius XII that the Allied forces will do everything in their power not to do physical damage to churches and other historical sites in Rome. But of course, FDR also reminds the Pope that it's the top priority of the Allies to drive out Nazi forces from Rome and elsewhere, and therefore could make no promises that Rome would remain unscathed as a result of those bombing runs.
Is there any significance to Pope Pius XII choosing the same name as his predecessor, or not?
One could say this about Pius XII. His decision to take Pius XI's name obscured his predecessor's papacy and his life, to the point where I said earlier that often people are confused. When you say Pope Pius, you're automatically thinking of Pius XII. It was whatever his reason was, I don't believe he let it on. It was a significant element in the disappearance of Pope Pius XI as a historical figure, to the point where you may see very many schools and other things that are named after Pope Pius XII. I only know of one school, a high school in the United States, that's named after Pope Pius XI. Furthermore, Pope Pius XI is, I believe, the only Pope of the 20th century who has not been considered for canonization. And it's a further indication that the choosing of the name and then the importance of the church and the role of the church in World War II kind of knocked out the story of Pope Pius XI for a long time.
I see. And I also want to bring up one more thing that's in the chat, and that is Nostra Aetate and the Vatican II Council. I want to tell the audience that we will have a program coming up later in the year on a very important Holocaust educator who was a Catholic nun. Her name was Sister Rose Thering. And her work to rid Catholic textbooks of anti-Semitism were actually influential on Vatican II. And we're going to present a whole program on that. But I don't know if our panel might want to comment on Nostra Aetate, what it was and its significance.
Well, I'm certainly no Vatican scholar, but the significance, of course, of Nostra Aetate, which was issued as a result of the so-called Vatican II Council, which took place in the 1960s, was that finally, after basically 2 millennia of essentially official kind of Catholic anti-Semitic dogma, Nostra Aetate in 1965 was the declaration of officially disavowing disavowing the Catholic Church from anti-Semitism. So, in other words, the centuries and centuries and centuries of official anti-Semitic dogma, official sort of anti-Jewish dogma within the Catholic Church was declared over with the issuance of the Nostra Aetate Declaration in 1965. I think it clearly, from the point of view of Jewish Catholic relations, that was a hugely significant development, obviously a very welcome development. From a Jewish perspective, of course, it's often the sort of, well, what took you so long? And indeed, it did take 2 decades after the end of World War II for that policy to be declared. But nonetheless, that's the historical significance of Nostra Aetate.
So let's get to our final thoughts. So Stephen, any final thoughts you would like to share with our audience today?
Well, Olivia, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be talking about these issues, and again, I guess I'm always struck by the layers of complexity, as we've seen in talking about this story, as I certainly experienced while I was making the film. It's very easy to often talk about historical figures in black and white terms. This guy's a hero. This woman is a villain, vice versa, or what have you. I think at the very outset, Peter, I think you mentioned one of the books written some years ago called Hitler's Pope. And for all his faults, it's important to remember that Pope Pius XII, while he was a longtime friend of Germany, having served there, was no friend to Adolf Hitler, was no friend to Nazi ideology. So again, I think we're talking about not shades of black, not black and white, but ongoing shades of gray. These are very complex, thorny issues that we've been talking about today. And I think those complexities are issues that the Catholic Church itself and the rest of us will be thrashing out for years to come.
Father Charles Gallagher, the floor is yours for any final thoughts you may wish to make.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. I think I want to take up where Stephen left off. What struck me was one of the questions that flashed across the screen, I think is the first question that I got a chance to just glance at. And the questioner was saying, did LaFarge ever speak out afterward? Like, why didn't he say anything after the fact? He lived until 1963 to march with Martin Luther King. One of the reasons I've always thought he never came out publicly during the reign of Pius XII was that precisely he's a Jesuit priest, which I am. And what that means is, and this is the technicality of it, the granular side, If he had not taken his final vows in the Jesuits and spoken out against the Pope, he could have been dismissed from the order. The other flip side of that is if he had taken his final vows of incorporation, he would have taken a vow more or less to align himself with the perspectives of the papacy. Keeping that in mind, in 2018, I was able to do research where, because I had that same question, like, why didn't he speak out? 2018, I was fumbling around in the archives of the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA. And I found reports from LaFarge to the OSS about Catholic matters. And he's reporting to he's providing now information to the US spy agency. And no one has known that. Like, no one knew that. And my view was that's subterfuge, but that's kind of, he couldn't speak out publicly for backlash against his church. So he's going to go, and he's kind of, if he were found to have actually been passing that information, he probably would have been dismissed from the order, but we only found out about it 80 years later. And I found that to be fascinating. And he's still a kind of a person who wouldn't let go. And he found every avenue to try to do the right thing, even if it included espionage.
That's incredible. Peter Eisner, the last word goes to you.
People have often asked about the importance of the hidden encyclical, this document that John LaFarge wrote in the summer of 1938, and the Pope's desperate attempt to publish it as he was dying. The first public word of the existence of the encyclical came in 1972 with its discovery by the National Catholic Reporter. And after publishing it and writing about it in some detail, the National Catholic Reporter wrote an editorial to assess what they had found. And I'd like to read you a couple of words from that give you an idea of what was lost. They wrote, considering that Hitler had only begun to move into full-scale persecution of the Jews and had not yet begun planned extermination, considering the moral weight of the papacy, especially at that point in history, considering all this, we must conclude that the publication of the encyclical draft at the time it was written may have saved hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives. I think that when we consider what was lost, I've always mentioned as well that for me, there was only one unambiguous stance to take at the time when so much was known about the horrors of Nazism. Pope Pius XI and John LaFarge took a stance of absolute morality and humanity. They didn't win, but their moral stance survives.
Wow, what if, right? What if? Yeah, it's a heart-wrenching question. But we barely scratched the surface in this hour, and I just wanted to give my profound thanks to our phenomenal panel. Also, thanks to our audience that comes week after week. So don't forget, the next program is not next Sunday, which is Rosh Hashanah, but actually Thursday night. So please, I hope you will be there. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day, and take care. Thanks again. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.